Chapter 11 of the Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Judd Niven. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Chapter 11. Chapter 11. The Ballot Test. The Old Gentleman and His Diseased Relatives. A Hungry Spirit. Palming a Ballot. Revelations on Strips of Paper. An aptitude for deception is all the capital that a person requires in order to become a spirit medium, or at least to gain the reputation of being one. Backing up the pretense to mediumship with a show of something mysterious is all sufficient to enlist attention and ensure the making of converts. One of the most noted of the mediumistic fraternity, whose name I do not choose to give at present, steadily pursued his business for several years in a room in Broadway, in this city, and succeeded not only in humbugging a good many people, but in what was more important to him, acquiring quite an amount of money. His mode of operating was the ballot test, and was as follows. Medium and investigator being seated opposite each other at a table, the latter was handed several slips of blank paper, with the request that he write the first, or Christian names, on each paper, of several of his deceased relatives, which being done, he was desired to touch the folded papers, one after the other, till one should be designated, by 3 tips of the table, as containing the name of the spirit who would communicate. The selected paper was laid aside, and the others thrown upon the floor, the investigator being further requested to write on as many different pieces of paper as contained the names and the relation, to himself, of the spirits bearing them. Supposing the names written were Mary, Joseph, and Samuel, being respectively the investigator's mother, father, and brother. The last named class would be secondly written, and one of them designated by 3 tips of the table as in the first instance. The respective ages of the deceased parties at the time of their decease would also be written and one of them selected. The first test consisted in having the selected name, relationship, and age correspond, that is, refer to the same party, to ascertain which the investigator was desired to look at them, and state if it was the case. If the correspondence was affirmed, a communication was soon given, with the selected name, relationship, and age appended. Questions written in the presence of the medium were answered relevantly, if not pertinently. Investigators generally did their part of the writing in a guarded manner, interposing their left hand between the paper on which they wrote and the medium's eyes, and they were very much astonished when they received a communication, couched in affectionate terms, with the names of the spirit friends attached. By long practice, the medium was enabled to determine what the investigator wrote by the motion of his hand in writing. 9 out of 10 wrote the relationship first that corresponded with the first name they had written. Therefore, if the medium selected the first that was written of each class, they in most cases referred to the same spirit. He waited till the investigator had affirmed the coincidence before proceeding, for he did not like to write communication, appending to it, for instance, your Uncle John, when it ought to be your Father John. The reason he did not desire inquirers to write the surnames of their spirit friends was this. Almost all Christian names are common, and he was familiar with the motions which the hand must make in writing them. But there are comparatively few people who have the same surnames, and to determine them would have been more difficult. No fact was communicated that had not been surreptitiously gleaned from the investigator. An old gentleman, apparently from the country, one day entered the room of this medium and expressed a desire for a spirit communication. He was told to take a seat at the table and to write the names of his deceased relatives. The medium, like many others, incorrectly pronounced the term deceased, the same as diseased, sounding the S like Z. The old gentleman carefully adjusted his specs and did what was required of him. A name and relationship having been selected from those written, the investigator was desired to examine and state if they referred to one party. "Wall, I declare they do," said he. "But I say, mister, what has them papers to do with a spirit communication?" "You will see directly," replied the medium. whereupon the latter spasmodically wrote a communication which read somewhat as follows: "My dear husband, I am very glad to be able to address you through this channel. Keep on investigating, and you will soon be convinced of the great fact of spirit intercourse. I am happy in my spirit home, patiently awaiting the time when you will join me here, etc. Your loving wife, Betsy." "Good gracious, but my old woman can't be dead," said the investigator, "for I left her to hum." "Not dead?" exclaimed the medium. "Did I not tell you to write the names of deceased relatives?" "Diseased?" returned the old man. "Well, she ain't anything else, for she's had the rheumatiz orfully for 6 months." Saying which, he took his hat and left, concluding that it was not worth while to keep on investigating any longer at that time. This same medium not long since visited Great Britain for the purpose of practicing his profession there. In one of the cities of Scotland, some shrewd investigator divined that he was able to nearly guess from the motion of the hand what questions were written. "Are you happy?" being a question commonly asked the spirits, one of these gentlemen varied it by asking, "Are you hungry?" The reply was an emphatic affirmative. They tricked the trickster in other ways, one of which was to write the names of mortals instead of spirits. It made no difference, however, as to getting a communication. To tip the table without apparent muscular exertion, this impostor placed his hands on it in such a way that the pisiform bone, which may be felt projecting at the lower corner of the palm, opposite the thumb, pressed against the edge. By pushing, the table tipped from him, it being prevented from sliding by little spikes in the legs of the side opposite the operator. There are other ballot test mediums, as they are called, who have a somewhat different method of cheating. They too require investigators to write the names, in full however, of their spirit friends, the slips of paper containing the names to be folded and placed on a table. The medium then seizes one of the ballots and asks, "Is this the spirit present whose name is on this?" Dropping that and taking another, "On this?" So he handles all the papers without getting a response. During this time, however, he has dexterously palmed one of the ballots, which, while telling the investigator to be patient, as the spirits would doubtless soon come, he opens with his left hand on his knee under the edge of the table. A mere glance enables him to read the name. Refolding the paper and retaining it in his hand, he remarks, "I will touch the ballots again, and perhaps one of them will be designated this time." Dropping among the rest the one he had palmed, he soon picks it up again, whereat 3 loud raps are heard. "That paper," says he to the investigator, "probably contains the name of the spirit who rapped. Please hold it in your hand." Then, seizing a pencil, he writes a name, which the investigator finds to be the one contained in the selected paper. If the ballots are few in number, a blank is put with the pile, when the medium palms one, else the latter might be missed. It seems the spirits can never give their names without being reminded of them by the investigator, and then they are so doubtful of their own identity that they have but little to say for themselves. One medium, to whom I have already alluded, after a sojourn of several years in California, whither he went from Boston, seeking whom he might humbug, has now returned to the East, and is operating in this city. Besides answering sealed letters, he furnishes written communications to parties visiting him at his rooms. A sitting, however, being granted to but one person at a time, his terms are only $5 an hour. Seated at a table in a part of the room where is the most light, he hands the investigator a strip of blank, white paper, rather thin and light of texture, about 1 yard long and 6 inches wide, requesting him to write across one end of it a single question, addressed to a spirit friend, then to sign his own name, and fold the paper once or twice over what he has written. For instance, "Brother Samuel, will you communicate with me through this medium? William Franklin." To learn what has been written, the medium lays the paper down on the table and repeatedly rubs his fingers of his right hand over the folds made by the inquirer. If that does not render the writing visible through the one thickness of paper that covers it, he slightly raises the edge of the folds with his left hand while he continues to rub with his right, and that admits of the light shining through so that the writing can be read. The other party is so situated that the writing is not visible to him through the paper, and he is not likely to presume that it is visible to the medium, the latter having assigned as a reason for his manipulations that spirits were able to read the questions only by means of the odylic, magnetic, or some other emanation from the ends of his fingers. Having learned the question, of course the medium can reply to it, giving the name of the spirit addressed, but before doing so, he doubles the two folds made by the inquirer, and for a show of consistency, again rubs his fingers over the paper. Then more folds and more rubbing, all the folding additional to the inquirer's being done to keep the latter from observing, when he comes to read the answer, that it was possible for the medium to read the question through the two folds of paper. The answer is written upon the same strip of paper that accompanies the question. The medium requires the investigator to write his questions each on a different strip of paper, and before answering, he every time manipulates the paper in the way I've described. When rubbing his fingers over the question, he often shuts the eye which is toward the inquirer, which prevents suspicion, but the other eye is open wide enough to enable him to read the question through the paper. Should a person write a test question, the medium could not answer it correctly, even if he did see it. In his communications, he uses many terms of endearment, and if possible flatters the recipient out of his common sense, and into the belief that, after all, there may be something in it. Should the inquirer smell a rat and take measures to prevent the medium from learning in the way I have stated what question is written, he, the medium, gets nervous and discontinues the sitting, alleging that conditions are unfavorable for spirit communication. End of Chapter 11. Recording by Judd Niven, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. www.juddniven.com.
Of the Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Magdalena Cook. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Spiritual Letters on the Arm. How to Make Them Yourself. The Tambourine and Ring Feats. Dexter's Dancing Hats. Phosphorescent Oil. Some Spiritual Slang. Chapter 12. The mediums produce blood-red letters on the arm, in a very simple way. It is done with a pencil, or some blunt-pointed instrument, it being necessary to bear on hard while the movement of writing is being executed. The pressure, though not sufficient to abrade the skin, forces the blood from the capillary vessels over which the pencil passes, and where, when the reaction takes place, an unusual quantity of blood gathers and becomes plainly visible through the cuticle. Gradually, as an equilibrium of the circulation is restored, the letters pass away. This manipulation is generally produced by the medium in connection with the ballot test. Having learned the name of an investigator's spirit friend, in the manner stated in a previous article, the investigator is set to writing some other names. While he is thus occupied, the medium quickly slips up his sleeve under the table and writes on his arm the name he has learned. Try the experiment yourself, reader. Hold out your left arm, clench the fist so hard as to harden the muscle a little, and write your name on the skin with a blunt pencil or any similar point, in letters say 3/4 of an inch long, pressing firmly enough to feel a little pain. Rub the place briskly a dozen times. This brings out the letters quickly, in tolerably distinct red lines. On thick, tough skins it is difficult to produce letters in this way. They might also be outlined more deeply by sharply pricking in dots along the lines of the desired letters. Among others who seek to gain money and notoriety by the exercise of their talents for spiritual humbuggery, is a certain woman whom I will no further designate, but whose name is at the service of any proper person, and who exhibited not long since in Brooklyn and New York. This woman is accompanied by her husband, who is a confederate in the playing of her little game. She seats herself at a table which has been placed against the wall of the room. The audience is so seated as to form a semicircle, at one end of which, and near enough to the medium to be able to shake hands with her, or nearly so, sits her husband, with perhaps an accommodating spiritualist next to him. Then the medium, in an assumed voice, engages in a miscellaneous talk, ending with a request that someone sit by her and hold her hand. A skeptic is permitted to do that. When thus placed, skeptic is directly between the medium and her husband, and with his back to the latter. The The husband plays spirit, and with his right hand, which is free, the other only being held by the accommodating spiritualist, pats the investigator on the head, thumps him with a guitar and other instruments, and maybe pulls his hair. The medium assumes all this to be done by a spirit, because her hands are held and she could not do it. Profound reasoning. If anyone suggests that the husband had better sit somewhere else, the medium will not hear to it. He is part of the battery, and the necessary conditions must not be interfered with. Sure enough, accommodating spiritualist also says he holds husband fast. A tambourine frame without the head and an iron ring large enough to pass over one's arm are exhibited to the audience. Medium says the spirit have such power over matter as to be able to put one or both those things onto her arm while someone holds her hands. The party who is privileged to hold her hands on such occasion has to grope his way to her in the dark. Having reached her, she seizes his hands, and passes one of them down her neck and along her arm, saying, "Now you know there is no ring already there." Soon after he feels the tambourine frame or ring slide over his hand and onto his arm. A light is produced in order that he may see it is there. When he took her hands he felt the frame or ring, or, at any rate, a frame or ring, under his elbow on the table, from which place it was pulled by some power just before it went on to his arm. Such is his report to the audience. But in fact the medium has two frames, or else a tambourine and a tambourine frame. She allows the investigator to feel one of these. She has, however, previous to his taking her hands, put one arm and head through the frame she uses, so that of course he does not feel it when she passes his hand down one side of her neck and over one of her arms, as it is under that arm. Her husband pulls the tambourine from under the investigator's elbow, then the medium gets her head back through the frame, leaving it on her arm, or sliding it onto his, and the work is done. She has also two iron rings. One of them she puts over her arm and the point of her shoulder, where it snugly remains, covered with a cape which she persists in wearing on these occasions, till the investigator takes her hands, in the dark, and feels the other ring under his elbows. Then the husband disposes of the ring on the table, and the medium works the other one down onto her arm. The audience saw but one ring, and the person sitting with the medium thought he had that under his elbow till it was pulled away and put on the arm. Some years ago a man by the name of Dexter, who kept an oyster and liquor saloon on Bleecker Street, devised a somewhat novel exhibition for the purpose of attracting custom. A number of hats placed on the floor of his saloon danced, or bobbed up and down, in time to music. His place was visited by a number of the leading spiritualists of New York, several of whom were heard to express a belief that the hats were moved by spirits. Dexter, however, did not claim to be a medium, though he talked vaguely of the power of electricity, when questioned with regard to his exhibition. Besides making the hats dance, he would, apparently, cause a violin placed in a box on the floor to sound, by waving his hands over it. The hats were moved by a somewhat complicated arrangement of wires, worked by a confederate out of sight. These wires were attached to levers, and finally came up through the floor, through small holes hidden from observation by the sawdust strewn there, as is common in such places. The violin in the box did not sound at all. It was another violin under the floor that was heard. It is not easy for a person to exactly locate a sound when the cause is not apparent. In short, Mr. Dexter's operations may be described as only consisting of a little well-managed dexterity. A young man out west, claiming to be influenced by spirits, astonished people by reading names, telling time by watches, etc., in a dark room. He sat at a centre table, which was covered with a cloth, in the middle of the room. Investigators sat next to the walls. The name of a spirit, for instance, would be written and laid on a table, when in a short time he pronounced it. To tell the time by a watch he required it to be placed on the table or in his hand. With a tablecloth over his head, a bottle of phosphorated oil enabled him to see, when not the least glimmer of light was visible to others in the room. If any of the spiritualist philosophers were to be asked what is the philosophy of these proceedings, he would probably reply with a mess of balderdash pretty much like the following. There is an infinitesimal influence of sympathy between mind and matter, which permeates all beings, and pervades all the delicate niches and interstices of human intelligence. This sympathetic influence, working upon the affined intelligence of an affinity, coagulates itself into a corporeity, approximating closely to the adumbration of mortality in its highest admensuration, at last acuminating in an acumination. On these great philosophic principles, it will not be difficult to comprehend the following actual quotation from the Spiritual Telegraph. In the 12th hour, the holy procedure shall crown the Triune Creator with the most perfect disclosive illumination. Then shall the creation in the effulgence above the divine seraphemal arise into the dome of the disclosure in one comprehensive revolving galaxy of supreme created beatitudes. That those not surcharged with the divine afflatus may be able to get at the meaning of the above paragraph, it is translated thus: Then shall all the blockheads in the nincompoop dome of disclosive procedure above the all-fired leather fungus of Peter Nefninigo, the gooseberry grinder, rise into the dome of the disclosure, until co-equalled and co-existensive and conglomerate lummoxes in one comprehensive mux shall assimilate into nothing, and revolve like a bobtail pussycat after the space where the tail was. What power there is in spiritualism! I shall be glad to receive, for publication, authentic information from all parts of the world in regard to the doings of pretended spiritualists, especially those who perform for money. It is high time that the credulous portion of our community should be saved from the deceptions, delusions, and swindles of these blasphemous mountebanks and impostors. End of chapter 12.
Of the Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Chapter 13. Demonstrations by Samson under a table. A medium who is handy with her feet. Expose of another operator in dark circles. Considerable excitement has been created in various parts of the West by a young woman, whose name need not here be given, who pretends to be a "medium for physical manifestations." She is rather tall and quite muscular, her general manner and expression indicating innocence and simplicity. The manifestations exhibited by her purport to be produced by Samson, the Hebrew champion and anti-Philistine. In preparing for her exhibition, she has a table placed sideways against the wall of the room and covered with a thick blanket that reaches to the floor. A large tin dishpan with handles, or ears, a German accordion, and a tea bell are placed under this table, at the end of which she seats herself in such a way that her body is against the top and her lower limbs underneath, her skirts being so adjusted as to fill the space between the end legs of the table, and at the same time allow free play for her pedal extremities. The blanket at the end where she sits comes to her waist, and hangs down to the floor on each side of her chair. The space under the table is thus made dark, a necessary condition, it is claimed, and all therein concealed from view. The "medium" then folds her arms, looks careless, and the "manifestations" commence. The accordion is sounded, no music being executed upon it, and the bell rung at the same time. Then the dishpan receives such treatment that it makes a terrible noise. Someone is requested to go to the end of the table opposite the "medium," put his hand under the blanket, Take hold of the dishpan and pull. He does so, and finds that some power is opposing him, holding the dishpan to one place. Not being rude, he forbears to jerk with all his force, but retires to his seat. The table rises several inches and comes down to kerslap. Then it tips forward a number of times. Then one end jumps up and down in time to music, if there is anyone present to play. Loud raps are heard upon it, and the hypothetical Samson has quite a lively time generally. Some of the mortals present, one at a time, put their fingers by request against the blankets, through which those members are gingerly squeezed by what might be a hand, if there was one under the table. A person being told to take hold of the top of the table at the ends, he does so, and finds it so heavy that he can barely lift it. Setting it down, he is told to raise it again several inches, and at the second lifting it is no heavier than one would naturally judge such a piece of furniture to be. Another person is asked to lift the end furthest from the medium. Having done so, it suddenly becomes quite weighty, and, relaxing his hold, it comes down with much force upon the floor. Thus, by the power exercised beneath the table of an assumed spirit, that piece of cabinetware becomes heavy or light, and is moved in various ways, the medium not appearing to do it. In addition to her other fixins, this medium has a spirit dial, so called, on which letters of the alphabet, the numerals, and such words as yes, no, and don't know. The whole thing is so arranged that the pulling of a string makes an index hand go the circuit of the dial face, and it can be made to stop at any of the characters or words thereon. This spirit dial is placed on the table near the end furthest from the medium, the string passing through a hole and hanging beneath. In the end of the string there is a knot. While the medium remains in the same position in which she sat when the other "manifestations" were produced, communications are spelled out through the dial, that index being moved by some power under the table that pulls the string. A coil spring makes the index fly back to the starting point when the power is relaxed at each indication of a character or word. The orthography of these spirits is bad, if not worse. Now for an explanation of the various "manifestations" that I have enumerated. The medium is simply handy with her feet. To sound the accordion and ring the bell at the same time, she has to take off one of her shoes or slippers, the latter being generally worn by her on these occasions. That done, she gets to the handle of the tea bell between the toes of her right foot, through a hole in her stocking, then putting the heel of the same foot on the keys of the accordion, and the other foot into the strap on the bellows part of that instrument, she easily sounds it, the motion necessary to do this also causing the bell to ring. She can readily pass her heels over the keys to produce different notes. She is thus able to make sounds on the accordion that approximate to the very simple tune of "Bounding Billows," and that is the extent of her musical ability when only using her "pedals." Well, to get a congress gaiter off the foot without using the hands is quite easy, but how to get one on again, those members not being employed to do it, would puzzle most people. It is not difficult to do, however, if a cord has been attached to the strap of the gaiter and tied to the leg above the calf. The cord should be slack, and that will admit of the gaiter coming off. To get it on, the toe has to be worked into the top of it, then pulling on the cord with the toe of the other foot will accomplish the rest. The racket with the dishpan is made by putting the toe of the foot into one of the handles or ears and beating the pan about. By keeping the toe in this handle and putting the other foot into the pan, this operator can stand a pull from an investigator who reaches under the blanket and takes hold of the other handle. To raise the table, the medium puts her knees under and against the frame of it, then lifts her heels, pressing the toes against the floor, at the same time bearing with her arms on the end. To make the table tip forward, one knee only is pressed against the frame at the back side. The raps are made with the toe of the medium shoe against the leg, frame, or top of the table. What feels like a hand pressing the investigator's fingers when he puts them against the blanket is nothing more than the medium's feet, the big toe of one foot doing the duty for a thumb, and all the toes of the other foot being used to imitate fingers. The pressure of these through a thick blanket cannot well be distinguished from that of a hand. When this experiment is to be made, the medium wears slippers that she can readily get off her feet. To make the table heavy, the operator presses her knees outwardly against the legs of the table, then presses down in opposition to the party who is lifting, or she presses her knees against that surface of the legs of the table that is toward her, while her feet are hooked around the lower part of the legs. That gives her a leverage, by means of which she can make the whole table or the end furthest from her seem quite heavy, and if the person lifting it suddenly relaxes his hold, it will come down with a forcible bang to the floor. To work the "spirit dial," the medium has only to press the string with the toe of her foot against the top of the table, and slide it, the string, along till the index points at the letter or word she wishes to indicate. The frame of the dial is beveled, with the face declining toward the medium, so she has no difficulty in observing where the index points. After concluding her performance under the table, this medium sometimes moves her chair about 2 feet back, and sits with her side toward the end of the table, with one leg of which, however, the skirt of her dress comes in contact. Under cover of the skirt, she then hooks her foot around the leg of the table and draws it toward her. This is done without apparent muscular exertion, while she is engaged in conversation, and the parties present are humbugged into the belief that the table was moved without "mortal contact," so they report to outsiders. This medium has a "manager," and he does his best in managing the matter to prevent Samson being caught in the act of cheating. The medium, too, is vigilant, notwithstanding her appearance of carelessness and innocent simplicity. A sudden rising of the blanket once exposed to view her pedal extremities in active operation. Another of the dark circle mediums gets a good deal of sympathy on account of her "delicate health." Her health is not so delicate, however, as to prevent her from laboring hard to humbug people with "physical demonstrations." She operates only in private, in presence of a limited number of people. A circle being formed, the hands of all the members are joined except at one place where a table intervenes. Those sitting next to this table place a hand upon it, the other hand of each of these parties being joined with the circle. The medium takes a position close by the table, and during the manifestations is supposed to momentarily touch with her 2 hands the hands of those parties sitting next to the table. Of course, she could accomplish little or nothing if she allowed her hands to be constantly held by investigators, so she hit upon the plan mentioned above, to make the people present believe that the musical instruments are not sounded by her. These instruments are within her reach, and instead of touching the hands of those next to the table with both her hands, as supposed, she touches alternately their hands with but one of hers. The other she expertly uses in sounding the instruments. Several years ago, at one of the circles of this medium, in St. John's, Michigan, a light was suddenly introduced, and she was seen in the act of doing what she had asserted to be done by the spirits. She has also been exposed as an impostor in other places. As I have said before, the mediums always insist on having such "conditions" as will best enable them to deceive the senses and mislead the judgment. If there were a few more detectives like Dr. Von Vleck, the whole mediumistic fraternity would soon "come to grief." End of chapter 13.
Of the Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jesse. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum, Spiritual Photographing, Chapter 14. Spiritual Photographing. Colorado Jewett and the Spirit Photographs of General Jackson, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Stephen A. Douglas, Napoleon Bonaparte, etc. A lady of distinction seeks and finds a spiritual photograph of her deceased infant and her dead brother who was yet alive. How it was done. In answer to numerous inquiries and several threats of prosecution for libel, in consequence of what I have written in regard to impostors who, for money, perform tricks of legerdemain and attribute them to the spirits of deceased persons, I have only to say I have no malice or antipathies to gratify in these expositions. In undertaking to show up the ancient and modern humbugs of the world, I am determined, so far as in me lies, to publish nothing but the truth. This I shall do, with good motives and for justifiable ends, and I shall do it fearlessly and conscientiously. No threats will intimidate, no fawnings will flatter me from publishing everything that is true, which I think will contribute to the information, or to the amusement, of my readers. Some correspondents ask me if I believe that all pretensions to intercourse with departed spirits are impositions. I reply that if people declare that they privately communicate with, or are influenced to write or speak by invisible spirits, I cannot prove that they are deceived, or are attempting to deceive me, although I believe that one or the other of these propositions is true. But when they pretend to give me communications from departed spirits, to tie or untie ropes, to read sealed letters, or to answer test questions through spiritual agencies, I pronounce all such pretensions ridiculous impositions, and I stand ready at any time to prove them so, or to forfeit $500 whenever these pretended mediums will succeed in producing their wonderful manifestations in a room of my selecting and with apparatus of my providing, they not being permitted to handle the sealed letters or folded ballots which they are to answer, nor to make conditions in regard to the manner of rope tying, etc. If they can answer my test questions relevantly and truly, without touching the envelopes in which they are sealed, or even when given to them by my word of mouth, I will hand over the $500. If they can cause invisible agencies to perform in open daylight many of the things which they pretend to accomplish by spirits in the dark, I will promptly pay $500 for the sight. In the meantime I think I can reasonably account for and explain all pretended spiritual gymnastic performances, throwings of hairbrushes, dancing pianos, spirit rapping, table tipping, playing of musical instruments, and flying through the air in the dark, and 1,000 other wonderful manifestations which, like most of the performances of modern magicians, are passing strange until explained, and then they are as flat as dishwater. Dr. von Vleck publicly produces all of these pretended manifestations in open daylight, without claiming spiritual aid. Among the number of humbugs that owe their existence to various combinations of circumstances and the extreme gullibility of the human race, the following was related to me by a gentleman whose position and character warrant me in announcing that it may be implicitly relied upon as correct in every particular. Some time before the presidential election, a photographer residing in one of our cities, an ingenious man and a scientific chemist, was engaged in making experiments with his camera, hoping to discover some new combination whereby to increase the facility of picturing the human form divine, etc. One morning, his apparatus being in excellent order, he determined to photograph himself. No sooner thought of than he set about making his arrangements. All being ready, he placed himself in a position, remained a second or two, and then instantly, closing his camera, surveyed the result of his operation. On bringing the picture out upon the plate, he was surprised to find a shadowy representation of a human being, so remarkably ghost-like and supernatural that he became amused at the discovery he had made. The operation was repeated until he could produce similar pictures by a suitable arrangement of his lenses and reflectors, known to no other than himself. About this time he became acquainted with one of the most famous spiritualist writers, and in conversation with him showed him confidentially one of those photographs, with also the shadow of another person, with the remark, mysteriously whispered, "I assure you, sir, upon my word as a gentleman, and by all my hopes of a hereafter, that this picture was produced upon the plate as you see it, at a time when I had locked myself in my gallery, and no other person was in the room. It appeared instantly, as you see it there, and I have long wished to obtain the opinion of some man, like yourself, who has investigated these mysteries." The spiritualist listened attentively, looked upon the picture, heard other explanations, examined other pictures, and sagely gave it as his opinion that the inhabitants of the unknown sphere had taken this mode of reappearing to the view of mortal eyes, that his operator must be a medium of especial power. The New York Herald of Progress, a spiritualist paper, printed the first article upon this man's spiritual photograph. The acquaintance thus begun was continued, and the photographer found it very profitable to oblige his spiritual friend by the reproduction of ghost-like pictures ad infinitum, at the rate of $5 each. Mothers came to the room of the artist, and gratefully retired with ghostly representations of departed little ones. Widows came to purchase the shades of their departed husbands. Husbands visited the photographer and procured the spectral pictures of their dead wives. Parents wanted the phantom portraits of their deceased children. Friends wished to look upon what they believed to be the lineaments of those who had long since gone to the spirit land. All who sought to look on those pictures were satisfied with what had been shown them, and by conversation on the subject increased the number of visitors. In short, every person who heard about this mystery determined to verify the wonderful tales related, by looking upon the ghostly lineaments of some person who, they believed, inhabited another sphere. And here I may as well mention that one of the faithful obtained a spirit picture of a deceased brother who had been dead more than 5 years, and said that he recognized also the very pattern of his cravat as the same that he wore in life. Can human credulity go further than to suppose that the departed still appear in the old clo of their earthly wardrobe? And the fact that the appearance of the shade of a young lady in one of the fashionable cut suave jackets of the hour did not disturb the faith of the believers fills us indeed with wonder. The fame of the photographer spread throughout the spiritual circles, and pilgrims to this spiritual Mecca came from remote parts of the land, and before many months caused no little excitement among some persons, inclined to believe that the demonstrations were entirely produced by human agency. The demand for spirit pictures consequently increased, until the operator was forced to raise his price to $10 whenever successful in obtaining a true spirit picture, or to be overwhelmed with business that now interfered with his regular labors. About this time the famous peace conference had been concluded by the issue of Mr. Lincoln's celebrated letter, "To whom it may concern," and William Cornell Jewett, with his head full of projects for restoring peace to a suffering country, heard about the mysterious photographer and visited the operator. "Sir," said he, "I must consult with the spirits of distinguished statesmen. We need their counsel. This cruel war must stop. Brethren slaying brethren, it is horrible, sir. Can you show me John Adams? Can you show me Daniel Webster? Let me look upon the features of Andrew Jackson. I must see that noble, glorious, wise old statesman Henry Clay whom I knew. Could you reproduce Stephen A. Douglas, with whom to counsel at this crisis in our national affairs? I should like to meet the great Napoleon. Such, here obtained, would increase my influence in the political work that I have in hand." In his own nervous, impetuous, excited way, Colorado Jewett continued to urge upon the photographer the great importance of receiving such communications, or some evidence that the spirits of our deceased statesmen were watching over and counseling those who desired to reunite the two opposing forces fighting against each other on the soil of a common country. With much caution the photographer answered the questions presented. Arranging the camera, he produced some indistinct figures, and then concluded that the conditions were not sufficiently favorable to attempt anything more before the next day. On the following morning Jewett appeared, nervous, garrulous, and excited at the prospect of being in the presence of those great men whose spirits he desired to invoke. The apparatus was prepared. Utter silence imposed, and for some time the heart of the peace-seeker could almost be heard thumping within the breast of him who sought supernatural aid in his efforts to end our cruel civil war. Then, overcome by his own thoughts, Jewett disturbed the conditions by changing his position and muttering short invocations addressed to the shades of those he wished to behold. The operator finally declared he could not proceed, and postponed his performance for that day. So excuses were made until the mental condition of Mr. Jewett had reached that state which permitted the photographer to expect the most complete success. Everything being prepared, Jewett breathlessly awaited the expected presence. Quietly the operator produced a spectral representation of the elder Adams. Jewett scrutinized the plate, and expressed a silent wonder, accompanied no doubt with some mental appeals addressed to the ancient statesman. Then, writing the name of Webster upon a slip of paper, he passed it over to the photographer, who gravely placed a scrap of writing upon the camera, and presently drew therefrom the ghost-like but well-remembered features of the sage of Marshfield. Colorado Jewett was now thoroughly impressed with the spiritual power producing these images, and in ecstasy breathed a prayer that Andrew Jackson might appear to lend his countenance to the conference he wished to hold with the mighty dead. Jackson's well-known features came out upon call, after due manipulation of the proper instrument. "Glorious trio of departed statesmen," thought Jewett, "help us by your counsels in this, the day of our nation's great distress." Next, Henry Clay's outline was faintly shown from the tomb, and here the sitter remarked that he expected him. After him came Stephen A. Douglas, and the whole affair was so entirely satisfactory to Jewett that, after paying $50 for what he had witnessed, he, the next day, implored the presence of George Washington, offering $50 more for a spiritual sight of the father of our country. This request smote upon the ear of the photographer like an invitation to commit sacrilege. His reverence for the memory of Washington was not to be disturbed by the tempting offer of so many greenbacks. He could not allow the features of that great man to be used in connection with an imposture perpetrated upon so deluded a fanatic as Colorado Jewett. In short, the conditions were unfavorable for the apparition of General Washington, and his visitor must remain satisfied with the counsel of great men that had been called from the spirit world to instill wisdom into the noddle of a foolish man on this terrestrial planet. Having failed to obtain, by the agency of the operator, a glimpse of Washington, Jewett clasped his hands together, and, sinking upon his knees, said, looking toward heaven, "O spirit of the immortal Washington, look down upon the warring elements that convulse our country, and kindly let thy form appear to lend its influence toward reuniting a nation convulsed with civil war." It is needless to say that this prayer was not answered. The spirit would not come forth, and, although quieted by the explanations and half-promises of the photographer, the peace messenger departed, convinced that he had been in the presence of 5 great statesmen, and saddened by the reflection that the shade of the immortal Washington had turned away its face from those who had refused to follow the counsels he gave while living. Soon after this, Jewett ordered duplicates of these photographs to the value of $20 more. I now have on exhibition in my museum several of the veritable portraits taken at this time, in which the well-known form and face of Mr. Jewett are plainly depicted, and on one of which appears the shade of Henry Clay, on another that of Napoleon I, and on others ladies supposed to represent deceased feminines of great celebrity. It is said that Jewett sent one of the Napoleonic pictures to the Emperor Louis Napoleon. Not long after Colorado Jewett had beheld these wonderful pictures, and worked himself up into the belief that he was surrounded by the great and good statesmen of a former generation, a lady, without making herself known, called upon the photographer. I am informed that she is the wife of a distinguished official. She had heard of the success of others, and came to verify their experience under her own bereavement. Completely satisfied by the apparition exhibited, she asked for, and obtained, a spectral photograph resembling her son, who some months previously had gone to the spirit land. It is said that the same lady asked for, and obtained, a spiritual photograph of her brother, whom she had recently heard was slain in battle, and when she returned home she found him alive, and as well as could be expected under the circumstances. But this did not shake her faith in the least. She simply remarked that some evil spirit had assumed her brother's form in order to deceive her. This is a very common method of spiritualists digging out when the impositions of the money operators are detected. This same lady has recently given her personal influence in favor of the medium Colchester in Washington. One of these impressions bearing the likeness of this distinguished lady was accidentally recognized by a visitor. This capped the climax of the imposture and satisfied the photographer that he was committing a grave injury upon society by continuing to produce spiritual pictures, and subsequently he refused to lend himself to any more manifestations of this kind. He had exhausted the fun. I need only explain the modus operandi of effecting this illusion to make apparent to the most ignorant that no supernatural agency was required to produce photographs bearing a resemblance to the person whose apparition was desired. The photographer always took the precaution of inquiring about the deceased, his appearance and ordinary mode of wearing the hair. Then, selecting from countless old negatives the nearest resemblance, it was produced for the visitor in dim, ghost-like outline differing so much from anything of the kind ever produced that his customers seldom failed to recognize some lineament that person possessed when living, especially if such relative had deceased long since. The spectral illusions of Adams, Webster, Jackson, Clay, and Douglas were readily obtained from excellent portraits of the deceased statesmen, from which the scientific operator had prepared his illusions for Colorado Jewett. In placing before my readers this incident of spiritual photography, I can assure them that the facts are substantially as related, and I am now in correspondence with gentlemen of wealth and position who have signified their willingness to support this statement by affidavits and other documents prepared for the purpose of opening the eyes of the people to the delusions daily practiced upon the ignorant and superstitious. End of chapter 14.
By P.T. Barnum. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eddie Winter. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Banner of Light. Messages from the Dead. Spiritual Civilities. Spirit Hollowing. Hans von Fleet, the Female Dutchman. Mrs. Conant's Circles. Payne's Table Tipping Humbug exposed. Chapter 15. The Banner of Light, a weekly journal of romance, literature, and general intelligence, published in Boston, is the principal organ of spiritualism in this country. Its general intelligence is rather questionable, though there is no doubt about it being a journal of romance, strongly tinctured with humbug and imposture. It has a message department, the proprietors of the paper claiming that each message in this department of the Banner was spoken by the spirit whose name it bears, through the instrumentality of Mrs. J. H. Conant, while in an abnormal condition called the trance. I give a few specimens of these messages. Thus, for instance, discourseth the ghost of Lolly. How do? Don't know me, do you? Know George Lolly? Yes, how do you do? I'm first rate. I'm dead. Ain't you afraid of me? You know, I was familiar with those sort of things, so I wasn't frightened to go. Well, won't you say to the folks that I'm all right and happy, that I didn't suffer a great deal, had a pretty severe wound, got over that all right, went out from Petersburg. I was in the battle before Petersburg, got my discharge from there. Remember me kindly to Mr. Lord. We'll tell 'em as soon as I get the wheels a little greased up and in running order, I'll come back with the good things as I said I would. George W. Lolly. Goodbye. Immediately after a message from the spirit of John Morgan, the gorilla, came one from Giles Talbot, who began as follows with a curious apostrophe to his predecessor. Hiya, old grizzly. It's lucky for you I didn't get in ahead of you. I am Charlie Talbot of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Was wounded in action, captured by the rebels, and died on their hands, as they say of the horse. It seems a little rude for one spirit to term another old grizzly, but such may be the style of compliment prevailing in the spirit world. Here is what Brother Clink said. John Clink of the 25th South Carolina. I want to open communication with Thomas Lafar, Charleston, South Carolina. I am deucedly ignorant about this coming back dead railroad business. It's new business to me, as I suppose it will be to some of you when you travel this way. So I will do the best I can to communicate with my friends, if they will give me an opportunity. I desire Mr. Lafar to send my letter to my family when he receives it. He knows where they are. And then report to this office. Good night, afternoon, or morning. I don't know which. I walked out at Petersburg. Here is a message from George W. Gage, with some of the questions which he answered. How do you like your new home? First rate. I likes, hey-ho. I likes to come here, for they clears all the truck away before you get round, and fix up so you can talk right off. Wasn't you a medium? No, sir, I wasn't afraid though, nor my mother ain't either. Oh, I knew about it. I knew before I come to die about it. My mother told me about it. I knew I'd be a woman when I come here too. Did you? Yes, sir. My mother told me, and said I mustn't be afraid. Oh, I don't likes that, but I likes to come. I forgot, sir. My mother's deaf, and always had to holler. That gentleman says folks ain't deaf here. The observable points are first that he seems to have excused his hollering by the habits consequent upon his mother's deafness. The hollering consisted of unusually heavy thumping, I suppose. But the second point is of far greater interest. George intimates that he has changed his sect and become a woman. For this important alteration his good mother had prepared his mind. This style of thing will not seem so strange if we consider that some men become old women before they die. Here is another case of feminification and restitution combined. Hans von Vliet has become a vrouw, what you may call a female Dutchman. It has always been claimed that women are purer and better than men, and accordingly we see that as soon as Hans became a woman, he insisted on his widow's returning to a Jew $2,000 that naughty Hans had Christianed the poor Hebrew out of. But let Hans tell his own story. I was Hans von Vliet when I was here. I was von Vliet here. I is one Frau now. I is one Frau when I comes back. I was no Frau when I was here, alluding to the fact that he was temporarily occupying the form of our medium. I wish you to know that I first lived in Harlem, state of New York. When I was here, I take something I had no right to take, something that no belongs to me. I take something. I takes $2,000 that was no my own. That's what I come back to say about. I first have some dealings with one Jew. That's what you call him. He likes to Jew me, and I likes to Christian him. I belongs to the Dutch Reformed Church. Do you think you were a good member? Well, I was. I believes in the creed. I takes the sacrament. I lives up to it outside. I no lives up to it inside, I suppose. How do you find yourself now, Hans? Well, I finds myself, well, I don't know. I not feel very happy. When I comes to this spirit land, I first meet that Jew's brother, and he tells me, Hans, you must go back and make some right with my brother. So I comes here. I wants my Frau, what I left in Harlem, to take that $2,000 and gives it back to that Jew's Frau. That's what I came for today, sir. Has your Frau got it? Well, my Frau has got it in a tin box. When I first go, I takes the money, I gives it to my Frau, and she takes care of it. Now I wants my Frau to give that $2,000 to that Jew's Frau. How do you spell your name? The Frau knows how to spell. Hans von Fleet. There's something you're cross in it. The Frau spells the rest. Ah, that's wrong. You makes a blunder. It's V, not F. That's like all Fraus. Do all Fraus make blunders? Well, I don't know. All do sometimes, I suppose. Didn't you like Fraus here? Oh, well, I likes 'em sometimes. I likes mine own Frau. I no likes to be a Frau myself. Don't the clothes fit? Oh, well, I suppose they fits. But I not likes to wear what not becomes me. It is scarcely necessary to make comments on such horrible nonsense as this. I may recur to the subject in future, should it appear expedient. At present, I must drop the subject of female men. At the head of the message department is a standing advertisement which reads as follows: Our free circles are held at number 158 Washington Street, room number 4, upstairs, on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday afternoons. The circle room will be open for visitors at 2 o'clock. Services commence at precisely 3 o'clock, after which time no one will be admitted. Donations solicited. On the days and at the hour mentioned in the above advertisement, quite an audience assembles to hear the messages Mrs. C. may have to deliver. If a stranger present should request a message from one of his spirit friends, he would be told that a large number of spirits were seeking to communicate through that instrument, and each must await his turn. Having read obituary notices in the files of old newspapers, and the published list of those recently killed in battle, the medium has data for any number of messages. She talks in the style that she imagines the person whom she attempts to personate would use, being one of the doctrines of spiritualism that a person's character and feelings are not changed by death. To make the humbug more complete, she narrates imaginary incidents, asserting them to have occurred in the earth experience of the spirit who purports to have possession of her at the same time she is speaking. Mediums in various parts of the country furnish her with the names of, and facts relative to, different deceased people of their acquaintance, and those names and facts are used by her in supplying the message department of the Banner of Light. If the assumed mediumship of this woman was not an imposture, some of the many people who have visited for the purpose of getting communication from their spirit friends would have been gratified. In most of the messages published in the Banner, the spirits purporting to give them express a great desire to have their mortal friends receive them, but those mortals who seek to obtain through Mrs. Conant satisfactory messages from their spirit friends are not gratified, the medium not being posted. The mediums are as much opposed to new tests as a non-committal politician. Time and again have leading spiritualists in various parts of the country endorsed as spiritual manifestations what was subsequently proved to be an imposture. Several years ago a man by the name of Payne created a great sensation in Worcester, Massachusetts, by causing a table to move without contact, he claiming that it was done by spirits through his mediumship. He subsequently came to New York and exhibited the manifestation at the house of a spiritualist, where he boarded, in the upper part of the city. A great many spiritualists, and not a few skeptics, went to see his performance. Paine was a very soft-spoken, good sort of a fellow, and appeared to be quite sincere in his claims to mediumship. He received no fee from those who witnessed his exhibition, and that fact, in connection with others, tended to disarm people of suspicion. His séances were held in the evening, and each visitor was received by him at the door, and immediately conducted to a seat next to the wall of the room. The visitors all in and seated, Mr. Paine took a seat with the rest in the circle. In the middle of the room a small table had previously been placed, and the gas had been turned partly off, leaving just enough light to make objects look ghostly. In order to get harmonized, singing was indulged in for a short time by members of the circle. Soon a number of raps would be heard in the direction of the table, and one side of that piece of furniture would be seen to rise about an inch from the floor. Some very naturally wanted to rush to the table and investigate the matter more closely, but Paine forbade that. The necessary conditions must be observed, he said, or there would be no further manifestations of spirit power. As there was no one nearer to the table than 6 or 8 feet, the fact of its moving very naturally astonished the skeptics present. Several seeing mediums who attended Mr. Paine's séances were able to see the spirits, so they declared, who moved the table. One was described as a big Injun, who cut various capers, and appeared to be much delighted with the turn of affairs. Believers were wonderfully well pleased to know that at last a medium was developed through whom the inhabitants of another world could manifest their presence to mortals in such a way that no one could gainsay the fact. The invisibles freely responded by raps on the table to various questions asked by those in the circle. They thumped time to lively tunes, and seemed to have a decidedly good time of it in their particular way. When the séance was concluded, Mr. Paine freely permitted an examination of his table. In the Sunday spiritual conferences, then held in Clinton Hall, leading spiritualists gave an account of the manifestations of the spirits through Mr. Paine, and as believers congratulated themselves upon the existence of such indubitable facts. The spiritualist in whose house this exhibition of table moving without contact took place was well known as a man of strict honesty, and it was reasonably presumed that no mechanical contrivance could be used without his cognizance, in thus moving a piece of his furniture, for the table belonged to him, and that he would countenance a deception was out of the question. There were in the city 3 gentlemen who had for some time been known as spiritualists, but they were, at the period of Paine's debut as a medium in New York, very skeptical with regard to physical manifestations. They had, a short time before, detected the Davenports and other professed mediums in the practice of imposture, and they determined not to accept as true Paine's pretence to mediumship, till after a thorough investigation of his manifestations they should fail to find a material cause for them. After attending several of his séances, these gentlemen concluded that Paine moved the table by means of a mechanical contrivance fixed under the floor. One of this trio of investigators was a mechanic, and he had conceived a way, and it seemed to him the only way, in which the manifestation could be produced under the circumstances that apparently attended it. Paine was a mechanic, and these parties were aware of that fact. They made an appointment with him for a private séance. The evening fixed upon having arrived, they met with him at his room. The table was raised, and raps were made upon it as had been done on previous occasions. One of the three investigators stepped to the door of the room, locked it, put the key in his pocket, took off his coat, and told Mr. Paine that he was determined to search his (Paine's) person, and that if he did not find about him a small, short iron rod, by means of which, through a hole in the floor, a lever underneath was worked in moving the table, he (the speaker) would beg his (Mr. Paine's) pardon, and be forever after a firm believer in the power of disembodied spirits to move ponderable bodies. This impressive little speech had a decided and instant effect upon the medium. "Gentlemen," said the latter, "I might as well own up. Please to be quietly seated, and I will tell you all about it." And he did tell them all about it, subsequently repeating his confession before quite a number of disgusted and cheaply sold spiritualists at the New York Spirit Lyceum. The theory formed by one of the three investigators referred to as to Paine's method of moving the table was singularly correct. Whilst the family with whom Paine boarded was away one day in attendance at a funeral, he took up several of the floorboards of the back parlor, and on the underside of them affixed a lever with a crosspiece at one end of it, and in the ends of the crosspiece bits of wire were inserted, the wire being just as far apart as the legs of the table to be moved. Small holes were made in the floorboards for the wire to come through to reach the table legs. The other end of the lever came within an inch or two of the wall. When all the arrangements were completed, and the table being properly placed in order to move it, Mr. Paine had only to insert one end of a short iron rod in a hole in the heel of his boot, put the other end of the rod through a hole in the floor just under the edge of the carpet near the wall, and then press the rod down upon the end of the lever. The movements necessary in fixing the iron rod to its place were executed while he was picking up his handkerchief that he had purposely dropped. The middle of the lever was attached to the floor, and the end with the crosspiece, being the heavier, brought the other end up close against the floor, the wires in the crosspiece having their points just within the bottom of the holes in the floor. The room was carpeted, and there were little marks on the carpet known only to Paine that enabled him to know just where to place the table. Pressing down the end of the lever nearest the wall an inch would bring the wires in the crosspiece on the other end of the lever against the legs of the table and slightly raise the latter. One of the wires would strike the table leg a very little before the other did, and that enabled the medium to very nicely rap time to the tunes that were sung or played. Of course, no holes that anyone could observe would be made in the carpet by the passage of the wires through it. For appearance's sake, Paine, before his detection, visited by invitation the houses of several different spiritualists for the purpose of holding seances, but he never got a table to move without contact in any other than the place where he had properly prepared the conditions. End of chapter 15.